Good morning. If I could ask everybody to come back and take your seat. We're going to try and keep this running on schedule. If I could ask someone to cruise through the outer foyer, get people to come back in. I could play a tune on one of the xylophone. Well, this morning is off to a great start. Shh. Okay. We wait for about 3 or 4 more people to come through the door, because they come through the door, they're talking. Oh, well. Yeah. All right. For those of you that don't know, my name is Ed Emmett. I'm fellow in Energy and Transportation Policy here at the Baker Institute. And I get the privilege of moderating the second panel. The second panel is titled Future Texas Vaccine Policy Issues. Now, most of you know me from another role. Yes, I was county judge for 12 years, from 2007 to 2019. And before that, I served 8 years in the Texas legislature, so I have a little bit of background in this. But the piece that most people don't know, talking about lobby influence, my wife of 47 years, Gwen, was chairman of the Immunization Partnership for a while and was on the board for a long time. So there was a built-in influence in my life, shall we say. So while the first panel predominantly discussed issues related to vaccine policy over the past 2 years, that's all well and good, but we got to look forward. What's going to happen in the future? And that's what this panel is about. What challenges will we see? What type of bills are we going to be looking at in the legislature coming up? And what kind of pushback will we get when, I'll say, our side tries to promote vaccine policy and the anti-vax advocates push back, or vice versa? Because let's face it, there are likely to be more bills that are anti-vaccine than there are pro-vaccine. And what kind of pushback will we get? And I'm going to go off script a little bit, because I remember it was all put in perspective for me when then Chairman Representative John Zerwas had a bill to require healthcare workers to be vaccinated for common diseases. And years earlier, that would have been an absolute no-brainer. Of course, healthcare workers have to be vaccinated. Why is that controversial? And a close friend of mine, who was really one of the more moderate types in the legislature, voted against the bill, voted to kill that bill. And I called him, and I won't say his name. I said, "Why'd you do that?" His exact quote was, "I just don't want the crazies coming after me in the primary." And that puts it all in perspective. The anti-vax group was well organized, and without getting into politics too much, you know, both parties have kind of gone off here. And so you have active groups that influence primary elections. And those primary elections, for the most part, determine who's going to win, because most of the districts aren't drawn in a way that they're competitive. I think there are only a handful in the whole state of Texas, frankly, in the Texas House. So similar to the first panel, we're going to have only 2 experts discuss how future vaccine policy just might take shape in the state of Texas. And then we're going to hopefully have 30 minutes left for questions. And please, we'll take the questions at the end and request that you, and this is very challenging to those people like me of my age, you got to submit the questions via Google form, and then I'm going to try and figure out how to read them on a tablet. We're going to work through this. My grandchildren are not here to help me, which is a real problem. But you can access the QR code on the right on your thing. So with all that said, our first presenter this morning is Reika Lakshmanan. Ms. Lakshmanan is the Chief Strategic Officer at the Immunization Partnership, which hopefully all of you know is a nonprofit organization based here. She is also recognized as a contributing expert at the Baker Institute for Public Policy in the Center for Health and Biosciences. At the Immunization Partnership, her work involves developing and implementing public policy strategies to improve Texas immunization rates. Not an easy task. That includes working with state legislators to help promote vaccine legislation to improve and increase vaccine access and the immunization rates. She also advises other organizations on how do you build grassroots networks, as well as teach constituents how to communicate and engage with lawmakers. Ms. Lakshmanan has worked with the Baker Institute and Dr. Matthews for the past 5 years, helps guide research questions, helps edit manuscripts with students, and writes policy briefs and commentaries. So this morning, according to my note anyway, she will present major issues she anticipates in the 2023 Texas State Legislature, as well as, on a positive note, opportunities. So please join me in welcoming Ms. Lakshmanan to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to start off with a short story about a time when there was uncertainty across America. An epidemic wreaked havoc across communities near and far, resulting in an outbreak that was out of control. People who were infected by this disease were maimed, some of them died, and some of them had long-term ill effects. Families were torn apart, newspapers published daily stories about the devastating impact of the disease. And health officials had to figure out, how do we get this outbreak under control and to prevent the spread of more disease? And so what these health officials did was they decided to require people to be vaccinated. And while most people complied, there were some groups of people who opposed vaccination. And what they ended up doing was they coalesced. They tried to dissuade others from getting vaccinated. They created materials, they had meetings, and they spread misinformation. And some, in fact, took to the legal system to challenge the requirement and filed a lawsuit which went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So you may be thinking, okay, why are you telling me this story? I've been living this whole drama for the past couple of years. Well, in fact, I'm not talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm talking about a time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when there was a smallpox outbreak in the northeast part of the country, and specifically talking about Massachusetts, where this gentleman named Henning Jacobson, did not want to be vaccinated against smallpox vaccine, and health officials in Massachusetts were trying to control this outbreak desperately. And so Mr. Jacobson decided to exercise his right and filed a lawsuit against the state of Massachusetts because he didn't want to be vaccinated. And his case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in 1905, and I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of details, but in 1905, the Supreme Court made a decision, and they decided that the state of Massachusetts has the right, as the state, to protect their people against infectious diseases. And this is a very important case because it is a pillar to public health law, and it is a court case that continues to be upheld to today. And so the circle comes around, right? History always repeats itself. And I think over the course of the next few minutes, we want to talk about how, unfortunately, history repeats itself. But what we also need to do is to learn lessons from that and to really speak up on the benefits of vaccination. So kind of three issues we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about or discuss the vaccine policy challenges prior to and during the COVID-19 pandemic. What did we experience in a pandemic legislative session? And it was definitely a doozy. And what is on the horizon for Texas and the nation in 2023? So I think it's important to kind of remind ourselves, why do we have vaccination policies? Well, vaccination policies serve as guardrails for public health. They help prevent the spread of infectious diseases. Vaccination policies help create a way to improve access to vaccines and improve immunization coverage rates, because that's what we ultimately want to do, is we want to make sure that as many people are vaccinated and protected against disease, not only to help themselves, but to help communities. And then, of course, keeping people healthy and protect them from preventable diseases. So despite the benefits of vaccination, protecting millions of lives and saving billions of dollars in healthcare costs, both indirectly and directly, and despite the fact that vaccines was declared as one of the 10 greatest public health achievements, according to the CDC, in the 20th century, unfortunately, we've seen over the years vaccine policies becoming politicized and becoming a political flashpoint. And what we're seeing are groups of individuals working together to undermine vaccine laws and policies by weakening and dismantling the public health infrastructure. And so they kind of do this in a number of different ways. This is, I would like to say, this is my own personal art. I'm trying to demonstrate chaos in the world, so it can be attributed to me. But like I said, what we're seeing is attempts to dismantle states' public health infrastructure and destroy the vaccine ecosystem. And one of the ways, groups and individuals try to do this is by going after state vaccine policies and legislation. They spread misinformation as fact, and they do this through public rallies, legislative engagement, and social media. Casting doubt, they promote doubt and discontent. And as Dr. Matthews said during legislative hearings last year, anti-vaxxers position fringe medical professionals as scientific experts during legislative hearings. They come in white coats, they look official, they cite studies. Oftentimes those studies are not rooted in accurate data, but that's what they do. Additionally, they elevate individualism, and the view is affording rights and liberties for some, but not for others. And as we all know that, when it comes to vaccination, it doesn't only affect you, but if you choose to vaccinate or you choose not to vaccinate, it affects everyone else as well. And then lastly, there's the politicking and the legislative activism. And they engage in activities through electioneering and capital engagement. And, as Judge Emmett had alluded to, that they are very, very involved in politics. So let's kind of take a look at the legislative activism. And over the past 7 years or so, we've seen this escalation in terms of how the anti-vaccine movement and activists have been engaging in state capitals. And so we need to go back to 2015, because I think that's the really kind of the start of the modern movement of how we've seen legislative activism take place. And so in 2015, many of you may recall, there was a measles outbreak in Disneyland in California. And as a result of that measles outbreak, which also just kind of carried over to other states as well, the state of California decided, there was legislation proposed, California Senate Bill 277, to remove personal belief exemptions for school entry. And that created a flashpoint. And ultimately, California did remove personal belief exemptions. But what also happened in that same year was the Texas legislature was in session. And so there was an attempt to introduce a similar bill in Texas to remove personal belief exemptions. And so what we kind of categorized as a new anti-vaccine movement was formed. And this activism was rooted under the disguises of freedom and liberty. And I do want to point out that, despite 2015 kind of acting as this new catalyst, the legislature did actually pass some really good positive vaccine legislation, which affected the state immunization registry. So we had these headwinds, but yet good sense prevailed, and we were able to see some positive legislation passed. Fast forward then to 2017. Remember, as Dr. Matthews said, the state legislature meets every other year. So in 2017 and 2019, we started to see increased pressures on the state legislature. Again, the anti-vaccine activism was growing and was increasing. But again, despite those headwinds, we did see some positive vaccine bills be filed despite the contentiousness. However, what we also saw were more anti-vaccine bills filed as well. For many, many, many years, we had seen positive vaccine policies introduced and very rarely saw anti-vaccine legislation introduced, but 2017 changed all of that. And so we started to see more anti-vaccine bills filed. And what we started to hear were the arguments anchored in medical freedom and liberty, and that was gaining traction. What we noticed was that arguments around vaccine safety just didn't really play inside with lawmakers. It was very difficult for groups on the other side to argue against the science. And so what we saw was a pivot in their arguments, and that pivot was to medical freedom and to liberty. And what we also saw in 2017 and in 2019 was kind of these marathon hearings leading to exhaustion. Lawmakers really started to get tired of having to hear about vaccines and about vaccine policies, namely because we were seeing hours and hours and hours of testimony related to vaccine bills. Keep in mind, though, is when you have a committee hearing, on the committee hearing, you have multiple bills being heard. It's not just your vaccine bill. It is, other bills related to health. And so it is not uncommon to have a legislative hearing stacked with, 8, 10 pieces of legislation that are being heard in committee, one or maybe even two of those bills being vaccine related. So we went through 2017 and we went through 2019. Let's kind of advance to 2020 and the present. So, in February, March of 2020, we have a global pandemic on our hands, and COVID-19 kind of created an opportunity on both sides, because when the pandemic was declared, we didn't have a vaccine. And so, we thought that, oh my goodness, we're living in a pandemic, and this is what life is like without a vaccine. But it also created an opportunity for folks who opposed vaccines to align with various groups who opposed public health measures like masking. And so we saw this sort of melding of minds coming together to align and to oppose a lot of the requirements and the mandates and the public health measures that were being introduced. And so, unfortunately, what we also saw was the pandemic serving as a gateway to erode routine vaccine policies. Okay. So I want to kind of just briefly touch upon, when you look at the anti-vaccine community and the movement, kind of who all do they work with? And we call it micro-constituent stacking, because at the end of the day, the vast majority of people support vaccines. They understand that there's value and there's benefit of getting vaccinated. And so they're really a small group. But what they do is they take all these different groups and they kind of make their stack a lot bigger. So they tend to align with anti-government groups, alternative medicine groups, right to life, parental rights, and liberty and medical rights groups. So making themselves inflated and bigger than what they really are. And unfortunately, there are real life consequences. I mean, we're living it, every single day. The the pandemic has had effects on childhood wellness immunization rates. We're seeing an increase in vaccine hesitancy, and infectious diseases are emerging or re-emerging. As we heard earlier, a case of polio in New York. We've got monkeypox. We're in flu season. So these are all compounded in terms of what we're seeing on a daily basis. And so what are we dealing with here in Texas? Well, it was alluded to that in 2003, there was an omnibus bill, and the bill was actually around restructuring the state health department. And this bill, Dr. Matthews affectionately called it as a Christmas tree bill, which is one way we call it, which is a very large bill. And in the 2003 legislative session, there was an amendment that was attached to this very large bill that had nothing to do with vaccines. It did have to do with healthcare, which made it relatable. And so an amendment was added onto this omnibus bill to allow for non-medical exemptions. And as a result of that piece of legislation introduced and getting passed, we've seen an increase, a year-over-year increase in the number of vaccine exemptions filed for children in order to attend public school. And you can see that it's a very upward slope. And this is data from the Department of State Health Services. And the last data point is 2021-2022 school year. And you can see that over 85,000 children have been opted out of one or more school-required vaccinations. So with that, in addition to campaigns being built on misinformation and the COVID-19 pandemic amplifying this anti-mandate, anti-government sentiments, we're really kind of in an environment that is very, very dangerous. So what I want to do is just kind of take a quick look at, Texas vaccine legislative history. And so this is some research Dr. Matthews and I and others did a couple of years ago, kind of doing a retrospective and looking at all the bills filed between 2009 and 2019. And in that period of time, that 10-year period of time, 104 vaccine-related bills were filed. And what is amazing is that even in that same period of time, 21 of those bills were enacted into law. And the vast majority of those bills passed in that 10-year period of time were pro-vaccine, and it had bipartisan support, which is very, very refreshing. However, Texas lawmakers have not been immune to anti-science and anti-vaccination rhetoric and activism. And what we saw last year in 2021, there were 4 legislative sessions, 1 regular session, 3 special sessions. We saw over 60 anti-vaccination bills filed across those sessions. And if you take that number and then you go back and you add up all the other years, going to 2003, we saw more anti-vaccination bills filed last year than we had in all those previous years combined. So as I said, last year was a very interesting year because we were in a pandemic, and of course we're still in the pandemic. But when the session started in January, that was when there was a very slow rollout of vaccines, COVID vaccines. COVID vaccines were not widely available, and so we were kind of going through that phasing process. And so we had 230 days of session when it's normally 140. As I said before, more than 100 vaccine-related bills were filed. Over 60% of those bills were anti-vaccination in one way or another. And what was interesting, we went back and looked at all those bills, and about 25% of those anti-vaccine bills had the word discrimination in the caption, and you're going to hear more about that shortly. And what we also saw was a very visible presence of opposers to vaccination. I mean, again, despite us being in the throes of the pandemic, we still had a lot of those very stringent and tight, public health measures in place. You had to have a negative COVID test in order to walk into the Capitol. We saw an active engagement from vaccine opposers. And so, over the course of the 230 days of the legislative sessions, what we saw were some emerging themes. We saw bills, and this is not only for Texas, but what we also saw nationally last year, and what we saw this year in 2022. Despite Texas not being in a legislative session, other states were, and so we've seen legislation related to schools, and that includes limiting access to vaccines. So, for example, not allowing school vaccination clinics to happen. We've seen legislation filed to alter, to weaken, or to even remove school requirements. We've seen a lot of legislation filed related to the workforce, whether it has to do with employee rights or workmen's compensation. We've also seen legislation filed related to new vaccines and constraining the use of vaccines under emergency use authorization. Again, legislation related to discrimination, whether it's civil liberty claims or creating unvaccinated status as a protected class. And then what we've also seen, and these are all things that we anticipate to see next legislative session as well, is the use of vaccines using certain kinds of vaccine development techniques or technology and limiting the use of those vaccines. And so there are real-life consequences when we start to alter and when we start to weaken these vaccine policies. So we've got misinformation campaigns, which can lead to the erosion of public trust, which can then lead to weaker immunization laws and policies, which can therefore lead to increased morbidity and mortality. And so, while sometimes it feels like policies are done in a vacuum and we feel like we don't necessarily have a hand in it, we're all active participants, and we all will be held responsible and will have to deal with those policies one way or another. And so one of the concerns we have as far as, advancing anti-vaccine legislation, during legislative sessions is that when you entertain, a lot of these proposals and misinformation, it ends up creating public skepticism under the cloak of legitimacy. It perpetuates vaccine misinformation talking points and undermines science. It gives into the false equivalency and legitimizes anti-science policies. What we have seen the past few sessions is this desire and need to, if a committee is going to hear a vaccine bill, we need to hear a positive vaccine bill and we need to hear an anti-vaccine bill. And so there's this false equivalency that is created. And then, of course, as we heard earlier, the kinds of testimony that is given oftentimes uses questionable, misleading, or factually incorrect data. So I think with all of that being said, it's really important to remember and to remind ourselves that Texas is a bellwether for immunization policies, the good, the not so good, and the indifferent. The pandemic has taught us that we cannot be flat-footed. The pandemic that we're all still living in, it's not, we're going to see future pandemics. And so it's really, really important to make sure that we've got the right policies in place in order to be ready for the next public health crisis. Despite a challenging 2021, believe it or not, good vaccine policies still passed at the Texas legislature. You heard from Mr. Navarro, earlier that there was a bill passed to get, have better transparency related to data. So it can happen. Vaccination policies are taken for granted with blatant attempts to undermine decades of public health achievements. Again, looking at the bright side, Texas lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have shown they can come together and pass pro-vaccine legislation. But we can't do it without the voices and the support of people who support vaccines. And again, the future of vaccine policy really does start in Texas, and it's up to us to set that example, not only internally in our state, but also to other states across the country. And with that, just many acknowledgments. Thank you to the Baker Institute for allowing the Immunization Partnership to be part of this project. Dr. Kirsten Matthews, who is my partner in crime, and Daniel Morali and the Baker team for just being a great support. And last, but certainly not least, to the Immunization Partnership team for being just great partners and colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reika. We got a little bit behind schedule, minor, but so I had a few things I was going to say, but I'm going to save those because we need to get right into the second question. As a reminder, since we didn't have one, use the QR code if you want to ask questions. It's much more civil. Next speaker this morning is Professor Valerie Gutman Cook. Professor Gutman Cook is the co-director of the Health, Law, and Policy Institute at the University of Houston Law Center. She also serves as the director of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics. Previously, she served as special advisor and senior attorney to the New York State Task Force on Life and the Law, the state's Bioethics Commission, where she helped craft policy and guidance related to pandemic preparedness and crisis standards of care, human subjects research, and surrogate decision-making. She's also conducted a legal review of the constitutionality of state vaccine mandates, which is, face it, a lot of what we're talking about today. And that includes individuals, businesses, other decision-making bodies that feel they ought to have liberty to make decisions about vaccination, but how does it jive with legal precedent? That's something that we always have to keep in mind. So this morning, she will present on the legal implications of existing vaccine legislation, as well as recent changes to existing laws. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gutman Cook to the stage. And hopefully you'll get to finish.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me here and for inviting me to focus on this really important and sort of novel issue. This issue of claiming unvaccinated as a protected class via sort of non-discrimination laws. So in May, and this was mentioned already by Dr. Matthews, but in May of 2021, Senator Bob Hall introduced Senate Bill 1669, and it was intended to, quote, prevent discrimination and mandates regarding immunization that take place as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The bill, which did die in committee, would have first prohibited discrimination against individuals based on their immunity status, and second, prohibited vaccine mandates of any kind, including both governmental and private mandates. While the bill did not refer to those who refused vaccination as a protected class, which I'll discuss exactly what that means in a moment, it did extend statutory protections for those who are not vaccinated. The bill would have extended those protections to children, eliminating all vaccine requirements, including those that previously existed, so non-COVID-19 related vaccine requirements for attending public schools in the state. Similarly, in September of last year, Representative Candy Noble and colleagues in the Texas House of Representatives introduced House Bill 39, which would have prohibited employer discrimination against those who choose not to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. And in October 2021, Senate Bill 51, also mentioned earlier by Dr. Matthews, was introduced by Senator Brian Hughes. And this bill also failed to pass before the Texas legislature adjourned its third special legislative session. But the law would have made any entity, including hospitals, vulnerable to discrimination lawsuits if they mandated vaccination for their employees. So while all three of these bills failed, they represent a rather novel approach to the anti-vaccine movement, one that may succeed in future legislative sessions. Opponents of mandatory vaccination in Texas and elsewhere have been introducing these vaccine anti-discrimination laws that would extend anti-discrimination protections to those who choose not to be vaccinated. They position anti-vaccine sentiments within a constitutional and civil rights framework, arguing that their choice not to be vaccinated qualifies them as a protected class under the law. So what does this mean? Well, private employers and businesses that seek to require the vaccination of employees, customers, and others are subject to federal and state anti-discrimination laws. Under these already existing laws, employers may not impose vaccination requirements that have a disparate impact on or disproportionately exclude employees based on their membership in a protected class. And there are a variety of federal laws that prohibit private employers from discriminating against protected classes or specific groups of people with a common characteristic, like race, color, disability, national origin, religion, veteran status, citizenship, and sex. Most relevant to our discussion here are two specific laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So the ADA, and coupled with the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, include requirements for reasonable accommodations and non-discrimination based on disability. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, religion, and sex, included as amended by the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, pregnancy. So under these existing federal civil rights acts and laws, employees may remain unvaccinated if they belong to one of these protected classes. So together, the ADA and Title VII require employers to provide reasonable accommodations to employees who, because of disability or sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance, choose not to get vaccinated against COVID-19 unless providing accommodation for those employees would pose an undue hardship on the operation of the employer's business. Notably, however, there are many groups that are explicitly not protected under these anti-discrimination laws, including those distinguished by education level, economic class, or membership in social organizations. Some state laws attempt to fill in those gaps, extending anti-discrimination protections to other groups of people, including on the basis of gender identity, sexual orientation, political ideology, or service in a state militia. As we've seen here, though, in Texas and in other states, some states are attempting to designate the unvaccinated as a protected class. These attempts may be distinguished from current federal and state rules that legally require exemptions from vaccine mandates due to already existing medical reasons, religion, pregnancy, or disability. So rather, it's argued that policies that, for example, allow vaccinated individuals to enter businesses or places of public accommodation, or those that allow vaccinated employees not to have to take regular COVID-19 tests on a regular basis, or those that provide extra sick time to vaccinated employees, or otherwise laws that grant, or policies, that grant those who are vaccinated preferential treatment, The argument is that those rules, those policies then, are discriminatory against those who refuse vaccination. And this argument attempts to equate unvaccinated individuals with those who have been historically disadvantaged and are protected by those federal and state civil rights laws that I discussed. So here's a map, and it's often changing, but this was accurate as of the last time I checked, which was a few days ago, that have proposed or passed such vaccine anti-discrimination laws. Some address COVID-19 vaccines specifically, and other states address vaccines generally, including all those vaccines that are mandated by schools, employers, and others and have been for decades. So the big one that will probably now be used as a model for other states that are attempting to do this is Montana, because Montana successfully passed House Bill 702 in 2021, in May. This law, quote, prohibits a person or a governmental entity to refuse, withhold from, or deny to a person any local or state services, goods, facilities, advantages, privileges, licensing, educational opportunities, healthcare access, or employment opportunities based on the person's vaccination status. This law has exemptions specifically for nursing homes and long-term care and assisted living facilities, but that's pretty much it. The law also forbids any employer, private or governmental, from requiring employees to be vaccinated. So in other words, Montana's law puts an employee's vaccination status in the same category as race, sex, and religion when it comes to employment discrimination. And violation of this law is considered discrimination under the Montana Human Rights Act. Significantly, this law impacts not just COVID-19 vaccination, but all vaccines, including those required for public school enrollment. So in February 2022, this law was challenged in court, and the judge upheld it, writing that the law, quote, merely prevents the employer from implementing the health and safety measures he wants, which is to treat vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals differently. So, except in Montana, under current Civil Rights Act laws, vaccination status is still not a protected class. However, as we've seen, many other states are exploring similar laws, have in 2021, and will continue to do so. So, for example, Virginia's proposed law would have prohibited discrimination based on a person's vaccination status with respect to COVID-19 vaccines in the context of employment, education, insurance, and issuance of driver's licenses or other state identification. And Utah's proposed law added immunity status to the list of protected classes under state anti-discrimination laws, which already included race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, and pregnancy. So what are the problems with extending anti-discrimination protections to the unvaccinated? So first, as a general rule, protected class designations are premised on a person's immutable characteristics or intrinsic traits, those that are impossible or at least incredibly difficult as a practical matter to change, or those traits that are so fundamental to personhood that it would be abhorrent for government to penalize a person refusing to change them. So this is considered necessary to protect individuals from unjust treatment. So laws that would extend anti-discrimination status to the unvaccinated tie vaccination status to one's innate identity. However, mutable or changeable characteristics like vaccination status or political leanings or group associations are not, as a general rule, outside of one's immediate control. Evidence shows that vaccine willingness is a dynamic thing, and, quote, opposition to vaccination is far from immutable. Second, unlike other anti-discrimination laws, extending civil rights protections to those who refuse vaccination has a negative effect on others in our community. Many of whom those existing laws are actually intended to protect. So the ACLU, whose mission is to protect civil liberties, has acknowledged that vaccine mandates are not one size fits all. Rather, vaccine mandates are permissible under certain circumstances. In fact, the ACLU has argued that, quote, far from compromising civil liberties, vaccine mandates actually further them. Rather than focusing on those who choose not to be vaccinated, the ACLU emphasizes that mandatory vaccination protects the most vulnerable in our population, including individuals with disabilities, communities of color, and children too young to be vaccinated. Third, these efforts are intended to, and will be successful at, hindering vaccination efforts during this and future pandemics. Jurisdictions that have proof of vaccination requirements, or have incentive payments for vaccination, or have employer-based vaccine mandates, tend to have higher vaccination rates. Conversely, those states that are driving the vaccine choice or anti-discrimination movement have the lowest vaccination rates. Efforts to designate those who refuse vaccination as a protected class intentionally undermine the ability of institutions and governments to encourage vaccination, and are likely to result in even lower vaccination rates. Further, the implications could extend beyond this pandemic, beyond COVID-19. Laws that designate the unvaccinated as a protected class would thwart efforts to protect the public from other transmissible viruses. In 2022, as we've heard already, the United States has already seen the reemergence of the polio virus in addition to an outbreak of monkeypox, the latter of which has already been declared a federal public health emergency. Both diseases have safe and effective vaccines that have been proven to control the transmission of these dangerous viruses. However, if the unvaccinated become a protected class, the spread of such diseases is likely to escalate. Fourth, and this is not the final reason, but it's my final reason today, classifying unvaccinated individuals as a protected class is also legally inconsistent with a history of vaccine mandates. Mandatory vaccines are, by their nature, an intrusion into individual autonomy and bodily integrity. But the right to individual autonomy is not absolute and may be limited in circumstances where individuals pose a risk to others. In the context of COVID-19, the risk of transmission and harm to others is great, particularly for at-risk individuals and communities. The Supreme Court, as we also heard earlier, held in 1905 that there are justifications when such intrusions are necessary, and it is essential to continue to abide by this precedent. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, citizens have used the legal system to enforce COVID-19 restrictions and, conversely, to argue against them. Efforts to declare the unvaccinated a protected class is just one weapon in an anti-vaccine advocate's arsenal that could severely limit our ability to control highly transmissible and dangerous diseases. Countering these efforts will be a prolonged but necessary process to safeguard the public health. Thank you.
I'll sit in the middle. No, this is fine. Well, I'm going to use the prerogative of being the moderator, and I'm going to ask the first question. You know, both of you mentioned monkeypox, and in just talking to average folks, the impact, I'd like you to comment on the impact of misinformation, and we know it comes from one side, but people get confused. And so when Omicron came along, locally there was an announcement we had the first Omicron death in the nation, and turned out that wasn't true. And then here in Harris County we also had a monkeypox case that turned out not to really be true. So when you have these, and I'll look at monkeypox specifically, which really doesn't affect, New York Times had an article yesterday, whatever happened to monkeypox. And so when the officials jump out and I won't say scare tactics, but they overhype something, then that allows people to say, well, maybe COVID was the same way. And we know that's not true, because we know the death, and those of us who have had COVID know it was not pleasant. So how do you deal with that going forward in the politicization of other diseases like monkeypox, where we know pretty much where it's limited to? I'm looking at you first.
I can start. So I would, my first instinct is sort of counter the language of misinformation. Misinformation, when we usually talk about that, is intentionally trying to misinform the public in a way to sway policy in a direction away from sort of what's actually supported by science and research. Rather, I think that the instances that you're giving are examples of changing information, where we're learning from our mistakes, or the information might not have been fully correct, but it's not being provided in order to misinform and change policy. I use the example when I was at the New York State Task Force on Life and the Law. One of the things I did was help write the guidelines for the allocation of scarce resources, specifically ventilators during a pandemic. And it was intentionally written for the flu pandemic, and it was published in 2015. And so when COVID-19 hit, we were one of the few states that actually had guidelines for this, right? How to allocate resources. And a lot of states started looking to New York and a handful of other states that had made this effort, that had done this research, that had done the work in advance. It turned out that New York did not adopt the guidelines for COVID-19 for various reasons. But what we've learned is that there was a lot of really good stuff in there. There was a lot of things that were problematic with that report. And we didn't know that, not because we were trying to mislead anybody, but because it hadn't actually been implemented in real life. And as we learn from policies like that, guidelines like that, where states have actually implemented crisis standards of care for allocation of resources during COVID-19, we've learned how to better allocate resources so it's done more equitably. To make sure that individuals who need those resources, or the individuals from communities that have not had those resources as much, are able to access them in more equitable, fair, thoughtful ways. And so those policies are constantly evolving. And so I don't think it's an issue of misinformation, it's that we are adapting and changing to new information every day. And so that would be sort of my long-winded answer to that question.
That's not bad. Now, I'm going to actually combine that question with another question. We talked about
complicating things, aren't you?
Oh, I am. But I can pick on you. I've known you a while. I'm going to combine that with what happened in Montana. The whole sort of up in the air questioning of vaccines that's come about because of all the things that have happened. Does that make it more or less likely that a Montana-style piece of legislation can pass in Texas?
I mean, Judge Emmett, you should know. You've been in the legislature before, so.
Long time ago.
Yeah. I would say never say never. I think we're in a very rocky climate that is unpredictable. So could a Montana-style piece of legislation move through the Texas legislature and ultimately make it to the finish line? I'm not going to say with absolute certainty yes. I'm not going to say with absolute certainty no. Again, because we've got these confluences, we've got these forces at bay. However, I will say, though, that I believe strongly that Texas lawmakers know the value and the importance of good public health policies. And I'm going to hang my hat on that they're going to make the right decision to advance good policies that will benefit all Texans and will help protect the public's health and keep those vaccine limiting bills at bay. But I'm not going to, it could happen, it could not happen, but people who support vaccines, this is why it's so important for everyone to speak up, to demonstrate, and to show our elected officials that we really do represent the majority, and those kinds of bills cannot be had in the state.
Okay. Now, reminder, if you want to ask a question, use the QR code. I'm not getting any new ones up here. So has anyone asked a question out there? Then I'm going to let you stand up and ask your question rather than trying to...
Should we not do that? Again, it's going to depend on the language of the law itself, but presumably the answer to that would be no, if you have sort of a Montana-style law.
Okay. So...
Judge, we got a question?
Yeah,
No?
well, I've got some more coming in here. See, I'm getting directions from all kinds of places here.
You're very good at multitasking.
Well, I've been told to ask these from the anti-vax perspective. In your report, you said mandatory vaccines are by their nature an intrusion into individual autonomy and bodily integrity. However, the right to individual autonomy is not absolute, may be limited in circumstances. Where does the authority for public health mandates come from?
Where does the authority come from? I mean, what I'm quoting is case law and statute. Language from the Jacobson decision from 1905 from the Supreme Court. So there's a long-standing legal precedent for this concept that that our rights end where we could harm other people by exercising them.
Any thoughts? Okay. Did the elimination of the philosophical exemption in California cause the childhood vaccination rate to increase?
I think it did, but...
It did help improve immunization coverage rates. What the result of that law being passed also led to the compromise of medical exemptions. So in every state, you have to allow for medical exemptions. There will be circumstances where children cannot be vaccinated for a variety of different reasons, and so you have to have medical exemptions available. And what we saw in California was, while obviously personal belief exemptions were removed, we started to see an abuse of medical exemptions. And so now what is happening is having to go back and re-examine the medical exemption law to ensure that that particular exemption is not abused, and it serves the purpose it's supposed to serve, which is to protect those individuals who just cannot be vaccinated because of medical conditions or whatnot.
So if we were to add vaccine status as a protected class, how would that impact other protected classes? Because I remember over the years, as you added one, then some of those who were already in a protected class kind of pushed back and said, well, wait a minute, that's not equivalent to who we are. I think you addressed that.
Yeah, to some extent I think I did. I think there's a similar debate going on in Alberta right now, where it's been argued that Unvaccinated are akin, are similar, are just like other minorities that have been historically disadvantaged and discriminated against in a myriad of painful ways. And there's definitely been advocacy and pushback against statements like that. Whether that actually affects the protections that are afforded to those groups, I'm not sure that it would. Perhaps they would, but I'm not exactly seeing. But from a sort of a social, personal, psychological perspective, I think it absolutely would have an effect on the other populations that have been historically discriminated against and for whom these laws are intended to protect.
All right, I've been given permission to go over by 5 minutes, and so for one last question, I've noticed that policies tend to bleed together now. It used to be vaccines stood on their own, but COVID brought in mask mandates, economic shutdowns. So you have some people who, they may not like the mask, and they would normally be for vaccines, but they equate them all. Do you see that as a problem in the upcoming legislative session?
Yeah, it gets murky because there is this blending together, and another tactic we've seen and we anticipate to see next session is, traditionally vaccine policies, will move through very specific committees. It'll move through the Public Health Committee on the House side, and then through the Health and Human Services Committee on the Senate side. And so what we see is the way many of this legislation is worded, it's to circumvent those traditional committee pathways. So what I mean by that is, we've seen vaccine bills in interstate commerce or in business, business committees. We'll sometimes see it in public education, of course, but these in the justice committees. So state affairs, for example. So what we're seeing is just some, different ways to try and advocate and push a lot of this anti-vaccine legislation, but outside of those committees where we would normally see it. And so, of course, when we're educating lawmakers, we tend to educate on the public health side. And so you've got, lawmakers who are in other committees that may not be familiar with this issue, now having to deal with, vaccine discussions, exhaustive vaccine discussions, when they don't necessarily have that frequency of exposure to the issue.
And you see, you've seen folks who have said, "Oh, I support this bill that would designate COVID-19 vaccine deniers a protected class," and that's it. And then you actually look at the bill and you look what it actually would have done, and it would have actually said that anyone who refuses vaccination of any kind in any setting is now protected by these rules. So a lot of the time, what folks think are in a bill versus what's actually in that bill are not always consistent.
Okay. Need real quick answers on this. A lot of the statistics have now come out that school children really weren't that susceptible to COVID. And you begin to hear people doing equivalency of, well, we were going to, we shut down the schools because of COVID. Turns out they weren't. And they're trying to say that they're not susceptible to measles and all the others, and we know that that's not true, but how's that argument going to play?
Well, I mean, it's not to say that children can't get COVID, and children have not been hospitalized because of COVID, and children have not died of COVID. And so, again, I'm looking at it from, if you have a tool, a very simple tool to help protect children against, a disease, regardless of the severity of it, if it's going to prevent them from being hospitalized or preventing them from dying, then please make sure that that they're vaccinated. I mean, I think that's the message that we just need to continue to reiterate, that the numbers may say one thing, but ultimately children are still impacted one way or another.
And children can also spread COVID throughout their communities, including amongst their vulnerable family members and other community members.
Okay. Well, I wish we had more time. I would ask everybody, not yet, but in just a minute, go out and grab a box lunch, come back in fairly quickly because we want to give full time to the conversation between Dr. Peter Hotez and Dr. Thomas Killian. And since I do have a microphone, my final comment will be, if you remember the Ebola crisis in Texas, which didn't really turn out to be that big, but Governor Abbott created an infectious disease task force, which I think we met once and never met again, because Dr. Hotez and I were both on it. Ask Dr. Hotez, see, I'm setting this up. Should the state have an ongoing infectious disease approach rather than treating Ebola one way, COVID one way, and the other? So, see, I get in my last word there. So, with that, please join me in thanking our two speakers this morning. Grab a box lunch and come back in.